I sometimes read public domain books here on Leaves of Glen, and they were written a long time ago, so they're usually racist or sexist or bigoted. But in there somewhere and all that is a story, and that's why those stories are famous. Other times, I read works from independent authors, and they're delightfully not racist, but they might have adult language or adult situations. So that's your warning, but I'm sure you are grown up enough to handle it. Don't write to me complaining. Oh, hi! Oh, you've reached the mansion of Glen here on the Leaves of Glen podcast. You found me in my drawing room here near the fire sound effect. This is where I read the hottest public domain books and short stories. This week, we're reading more chapters from David Copperfield by Charles Dickens. It's the 8th novel by Charles Dickens, first published in 1850. Before that, it was published as a serial from 1849 to 1850. It is widely considered his most popular work. Oh, about the author? Sure, let's learn about him. I'm running out of things to say with him for every new episode and every chapter. There's so many in this book. He was born on the 7th of February, 1812, and he died the 9th of June, 1870. I don't know why I feel like that's important to point out in every episode, but I've been reading from The Unparalleled Necromancer, an article written about him in mentalfloss.com or whatever, where he apparently used to be a magician, and boy, he loved being on the stage. He did this as a famous author, and apparently he was weird. So this is the third part of this article, because I am desperate to find anything to say about this man. Not long after the publication of the Pickwick Papers in 1837, Dickens did a reading of Nicholas Nickleby that was on the same bill as Ramo Sammy, a famous juggler and magician. That'd be weird, seeing a juggler and a magician on the stage, and all of a sudden like an author gets up and just reads some of his book. A few years later, he went to see a performance by a renowned Austrian magician named Ludwig Dobler. At the time, Dobler was at the height of his fame and had performed all across Europe for the likes of the Austrian Emperor Francis I. Francis I. Let's just say Francis I. Why get fancy with these people? And while in London, Queen Victoria. And had spent much of his professional life designing and manufacturing his own unique stage props, including a magical pistol that was able to light 100 candles all at once, and a bottomless wine bottle from which any drink imaginable could be poured on request, all of which helped him put on a truly remarkable show. So that's fun. I guess to waste time before the big grandfather clock goes off and tells me when to shut up, we'll recap the previous chapter. In the previous chapter, David finally meets some of the kids at his school, mainly the ones he has to share a bedroom with. The oldest, weirdly, where they stick an older one, who's 27, with all these children in the same room, talks David into giving him all his money and says, I'll hold on to it. Keep it safe. So, of course, it's all building up. You're like, this guy's going to take his money. He's going to bully him and take his money. And then he says, no, I'll even buy stuff with it. Go on, tell me what you want. You want some bread? Huh? You want some cheese? And then he actually goes and buys all of it, including wine, which is weird. Why did they let this big child, buy wine? I don't know. Anyways, he actually buys the stuff and he brings it back to the room where him and apparently 20 kids live in. And then there's a lot of underage drinking going on and gossiping about the teachers and the headmaster and what a bunch of losers they are. Apparently this is some weird second-rate school run by people that have never really been in the profession before. Then everyone goes to sleep. David, who is smitten with this older, wiser shepherd of children, basically watches that guy sleep. So that was disturbing. That's pretty much it. I plowed through that, got nothing else to say, and the grandfather clock isn't going off yet. What's going on in my life? Unemployment. Hung out with my kids. Oh, thank God. Didn't want to have to start talking about that stuff. I have nothing exciting to say. Well, with that, why don't we dive into the story? Well, this is going to be a long one, I can already tell, because I flipped through the pages. If you don't like it, don't listen. No one asked you to come here anyways. Into my mansion now, here in the library of the Leaves of Glen mansion. You don't want to listen to a long one? I don't care. Get out! Yeah, I'm surly. I'm not going to have a job pretty soon. I'm already spending way too much time by myself at home. It's just going to get worse, and I'm not going to get any nicer. Chapter 7. My, quote, first half, unquote, at Salem House. School began in earnest next day. A profound impression was made upon me, I remember, by the roar of voices in the schoolroom, suddenly becoming hushed as death when Mr. Creakle, burp, entered after breakfast and stood in the doorway looking round upon us like a burp. This is not a strong start to this episode. Like a giant in a storybook surveying his captives. Tungay stood at Mr. Creakle's elbow. He had no occasion, I thought, to cry out, silence, so ferociously, for the boys were all struck speechless and motionless. Mr. Creakle was seen to speak, and Tungay was heard to this effect. Now, boys, this is a new half. Take care what you're about in this new half. Come fresh up to the lessons. I advise you, for I come fresh up to the punishment. Oh, I won't flinch. It'll be of no use your rubbing yourselves. What? You won't rub the marks out that I shall give you. It's disturbing on a couple of levels there. I shall give you... now get to work, every boy. When this dreadful extreme was over, Tungay was stumped out again. Mr. Creakle came up to where I sat and told me that if I were famous for biting, he was famous for biting too. Is he still wearing the sign? Then he showed me the cane. And asked me what I thought of that. For a tooth? Was it a sharp tooth? Hey? Was it a double tooth? What the hell is going on? Hey? Had it a deep prong? Hey? Did it bite? Hey? Did it bite? At every question he gave me a fleshy cut with it that made me writhe. So I was very soon made free of Salem House, as Steerfourth said, and was very soon in tears also. Not that I mean to say that these were special marks of distinction, which I only received. On the contrary, a large majority of the boys, especially the smaller ones, were visited with similar instances of notice as Mr. Creakle made the round of the schoolroom. Half the establishment was writhing and crying before the day's work began. And how much of it had writhed and cried before the day's work was over, I am really afraid to recollect, lest I should seem to exaggerate. I should think there never can have been a man who enjoyed his profession more than Mr. Creakle did. He was a delight in cutting at boys, which was the satisfaction of a craving appetite. I am confident that he couldn't resist a chubby boy, especially that there was a fascination in such a subject which made him restless in his mind until he had scored and marked him for the day. I was chubby myself, and ought to know. I am sure when I think of the fellow now, my blood rises against him with the disinterested indignation I should feel if I should have known all about him without having ever been in his power. But it rises hotly, because I know him to have been an incapable brute who had no more right to be possessed of the great trust he held than to be Lord High Admiral or Commander-in-Chief, in either of which capacities is probable that he would have done infinitely less mischief. Miserable little proprietors of a remorseless idol, how abject we were to him! Exclamation point. What a launch in life, I think of it now, on looking back, to be so mean and servile to a man of such parts and pretensions. Here, I sit at the desk again, watching his eye, humbly watching his eye, as if rules a ciphering a book for another victim whose hands have just been flattened by the identical ruler, and who is trying to wipe the sting out with a pocket handkerchief. I have plenty to do. I don't watch his eye in idleness, but because I am morally attracted to it, in a dread desire to know what he will do next, and whether it will be my turn to suffer, or, somebody else's. A lane of small boys beyond me, with the same interest in his eye, watch it too. I think he knows it, though he pretends we don't. He makes dreadful mouths as he rules the ciphering book, and now he throws his eye sideways down our lane, and we all droop over our books and tremble. A moment afterwards we are again eyeing him, an unhappy culprit, found guilty of imperfect exercises, approaches at his command. The culprit falters excuses and professes a determination to do better tomorrow. Mr. Creakle, cuts a joke before he beats him. We laugh at it, miserable little dogs. Oh, we laugh, with our visages as white as ashes, and our hearts sinking into our boots. Here I sit at the desk again on a drowsy summer afternoon. A buzz and hum go up around me, as if the boys were so many blue bottles. What? A cloggy sensation of the lukewarm fat of meat is upon me. In parentheses, we dined an hour or two ago, and my head is as heavy as so much lead. Oh, I give the world to go to sleep, to sit with my eye on Mr. Creakle, blinking at him like a young owl. When sleep overpowers me for a minute, he still looms, through my slumber, ruling those ciphering books, until he softly comes behind me and wakes me to plainer perception of him, with a red ridge across my back. Here I am in the playground with my eyes still fascinated by him, though I can't see him. The window, at a little distance from which I know he is having his dinner, stands for him, and I eye that in instead. If he shows his face near it, mine assumes an imploring and a submissive expression. If he looks out through the glass, the boldest boy, Steerfourth excepted, stops in the middle to shout or yell and becomes contemplative. One day, Traddles, the most unfortunate boy in the world, breaks that window accidentally, with a ball. I shudder at this moment with the tremendous sensation of seeing it done, and feeling that the ball was bounded onto Mr. Creakle's sacred head. Poor Traddles, in a tight sky blue suit that made his arms and legs look like German sausages, or roly-poly puddings. He is the merriest and most miserable of all the boys. He's always being caned. I think he was caned every day that half year, except one holiday, Monday, when he was only rulered on both hands. And was always going to write to his uncle about it, and never did. After laying his head on his desk for a little while, he would cheer up somehow, begin to laugh again, and draw skeletons all over his slate. That's a dark side to a person painting a happy face. Before his eyes were dry, I used to, at first, to wonder what comfort Traddles found in drawing skeletons, and for some time looked upon him as a sort of hermit. He reminded himself by those symbols of mortality that caning couldn't last forever. But I believe, so he's got this weird outlook on life. But I believe he only did it because they were easy and didn't want any features. He was very honorable, Traddles was, and held it as a solemn duty in the boys to stand by one another. I suffered for his on several occasions, and particularly once when Steerfourth laughed in church, and the beadle thought it was Traddles and took him out. I see him now, going away in custody, despised by the congregation. He never said who was the real offender, though he smarted for it the next day, and was imprisoned so many hours that he came forth with a whole churchyard full of skeletons, swarming all over his Latin dictionary. But he had his reward. Steerfourth said there was nothing of the sneak in Traddles, and that we all felt that to be the highest praise. For my part, I could have gone through a good deal, though I was much less brave than Traddles, and nothing like so old, to have won such a recompense. To see Steerfourth walk to church before us, arm in arm with Miss Creakle, was one of the great sights of my life. I don't think Miss Creakle equal to little Emily in point of beauty, and I don't love her. I didn't dare. But I thought her a young lady of extraordinary attractions, and in point of gentility not to be surpassed. When Steerfourth, in white trousers, carried her parasol for her, I felt proud to know him, and believed that she could not choose but adore him with all her heart. Mr. Sharp and Mr. Mell were both notable personages in my eyes, but Steerfourth, this is not going in a good direction, was to them what the sun was to two stars. Well, stars are suns. I don't know where that's going. Steerfourth continued his protection of me and proved a very useful friend. Since nobody dared to annoy one whom he honored with his countenance, he couldn't, or at all events he didn't, defend me from Mr. Creakle, who was very severe with me. But whenever I had been treated worse than usual, he always told me that I wanted a little of his pluck, and that he wouldn't have stood it himself, which I felt intended for encouragement, and considered to be very kind of him. There was one advantage, only one that I know of, in Mr. Creakle's severity. He found my placard in his way when he came up or down behind the form in which I sat, and wanted to make a cut at me in passing, and for this reason it was soon taken off, and I saw it no more. An accidental circumstance cemented an intimacy between Steerfourth and me in a manner that inspired me with great pride and satisfaction, though it sometimes led to inconvenience. It happened on one occasion when he was doing me the honor of talking to me in the playground that I hazarded the observation that something, or somebody, I forget what now, was like something or somebody in Peregrine Pickle. And he said nothing at the time, but when I was going to bed at night, he asked me if I got that book. I told him no, and explained how it was that I had read it and all the other books of which I had made mention. Do you recollect them? Steerfourth said. Oh, yes, I replied. I had a good memory, and I believed I recollected them very well. Then, I tell you what, young Copperfield, said Steerfourth, you shall tell them to me. I can't get to sleep very early at night, and I generally wake rather early in the morning. We'll go over 'em one after another. We'll make some regular Arabian Nights of it. I felt extremely flattered by this arrangement, and we commenced carrying it into execution that very evening. What ravages I committed on my favorite authors in that course of my interpretation of them, I'm not in a condition to say, and would be very unwilling to know, but I had a profound faith in them, and I had, to the best of my belief, a simple, earnest manner of narrating what I did narrate, and these qualities went a long way. Oh, the drawback was that I was often sleepy at night, or out of spirits, and indisposed to resume the story, and then it was rather hard work, and it must be done, for to disappoint or to displease Steerfourth was, of course, out of the question. In the morning, too, I felt very weary, and should have enjoyed another hour's repose very much. It was a tiresome thing to be roused, like the Sultana Scheherazade. Not going to look it up, not going to figure out how to pronounce it, and forced into a long story before the getting up bell rang. But Steerfourth was resolute, and as he explained to me in return my sums and exercises and anything in my tasks that was too hard for me, I was no loser by the transaction. And let me do myself justice, however, I was moved by no interested or selfish motive, nor was I moved by fear of him. I admired and loved him, and his approval was return enough. It was so precious to me that I look back on these little trifles now with an aching heart. Steerfourth was considerate, too, and showed his consternation in one particular instance, and in an unflinching manner that was a little tantalizing, I suspect, to poor Traddles and the rest, Peggotty's promised letter. Oh, what a comfortable letter it was, ! Arrived before, quote, the half, unquote, was many weeks old. With it, a cake, and a perfect nest of oranges, and 2 bottles of cowslip wine. Really? More wine? What? This kid's like 9 years old. The treasure, as in duty bound, I laid at the feet of Steerfourth and begged him to dispense. Yeah, there's kind of like an unhealthy thing going on with him and Steerfourth. Now, I'll tell you what, young Copperfield, said he. The wine shall be kept to wet your whistle while you are storytelling. I blushed at the idea and begged him, in my modesty, not to think of it. But he said he had observed I was sometimes hoarse, a little roopy was his exact expression, and should be every drop devoted to the purpose he had mentioned. Accordingly, it was locked up in his box and drawn off by himself in a file, and administered to me through a piece burp of quill in the cork. When I was supposed to be in want of a restorative, sometimes to make it a more sovereign specific, he was so kind as to squeeze orange juice into it, or to stir it up with ginger, or dissolve a peppermint drop in it. And although I cannot assert that the flavor was imposed by these experiments, or that it was exactly the compound one would have chosen for the stomach. Oh, they spelled that weird. Stomachic. Well, I'm not going to look it up. That seems like a weird spelling of stomach. The last thing at night was the first thing in the morning. Oh, I drank it gratefully. It was very sensible of his attention. Yep, still not healthy. We deemed to me to have been months over Peregrine and months more over the other stories. The institution never flagged for want of a story, I am certain, and the wine lasted out almost as well as the matter. Oh, poor Traddles. I never think of that boy, but with a strange disposition to laugh. That's horrible. And with tears in my eyes was a sort of chorus in general, and affected to be convulsed with mirth at the comic parts, and to be overcome with fear when there was any passage of an alarming character in the narrative. This rather put me out very often. It was a great jest of his, I recollect, to pretend that he couldn't keep his teeth from chattering whenever mention was made of an algozel in connection. Okay, I'll look it up. I don't want to, but I'm going to do it. Yep. There's nothing for it. We'll never figure out what an algozel is. In connection with the adventures of Gil Blas. And I remember that when Gil Blas met the captain of the robbers of Madrid, and the unlucky joker counterfeited such an ague of terror that he was overheard by Mr. Creakle, who was prowling about the passage and handsomely flogged for disorderly conduct in the bedroom. Whatever I had within me that was romantic and dreamy was encouraged by so much storytelling in the dark. In that respect, the pursuit may not have been very profitable to me, but the being cherished as a kind of a plaything in my room, and the consciousness that this accompaniment of mine was brooded about among the boys, and attracted a good deal of notice to me, though I was the youngest there, stimulated me to my exertion. Oh, in a school carried on by sheer cruelty, whether it is presided over by a dunce or not, there is likely to be much learnt, Learnt. I believe our boys were generally as ignorant set as any schoolboys in existence. They were too much troubled and knocked about to learn. They could do no more than to take advantage than anyone can do anything to advantage in a life of constant misfortune, torment, and worry. God, that was like a page and a half before I got to a period. But my little vanity and Steerfourth's help urged me on somehow, and without saving me from much, if anything, in the way of punishment, made me, for the time I was there, an exception to the general body, insomuch that I did steadily pick up some crumbs of knowledge. In this, I was much assisted by Mr. Mell, who had a liking for me that I am grateful to remember. It always gave me pain to observe that Steerforth treated him with systematic disparagement, and seldom lost an occasion of wounding his feelings, or inducing others to do so. This troubled me the more for a long time, because I had soon told Steerforth, from whom I could no more keep such a secret than I could keep a cake, or any other tangible possession, about the two old women Mr. Mell had taken me to see, and I was always afraid that Steerforth would let it out and twit him with it. And twit him. I'm looking up twit. A silly or foolish person. Okay. Little thought. Any one of us, I dare say, when I ate my breakfast that first morning and went to sleep under the shadow of the peacock's feathers to the sound of the flute, which consequences would come out from the indoctrination of those almshouses of my insignificant person. But the visit had its unforeseen consequences, and of a serious sort, too, in their way. One day, when Mr. Creakle kept the house from indisposition, which naturally diffused a lively joy through the school. There was a good deal of noise in the course of the morning's work. The great relief and satisfaction experienced by the boys made them difficult to manage, and though the dreaded Tungay brought his wooden leg in twice or thrice, and took notes of the principal offenders' names, no great impression was made by it, as they were pretty sure of getting into trouble tomorrow, do what they would, and thought it wise, no doubt, to enjoy themselves today. It was, properly, a half-holiday, being Saturday, but as the noises in the playground would have disturbed Mr. Creakle, and the weather was not favorable for going out walking, we were ordered into school in the afternoon and set some lighter tasks than usual, which were made for the occasion, period. That was another insanely long one without a period. It was the day of the week on which Mr. Sharp went out to get his wig curled. So Mr. Mell, who had always did the drudgery, whatever it was, kept school by himself. If I could associate the idea of a bull or a bear with anyone so mild as Mr. Mell, I should think of him in connection with that afternoon when the uproar was at its height, as one of those animals baited by 1,000 dogs. I recall him bending his aching head, supported on his bony hand, over the book on his desk, and wretchedly endeavoring to get on with his tiresome work, amidst an uproar that might have been made the speaker of the House of Commons giddy. Boys started in and out of their places, playing at puss in the corner with other boys. Now, they were laughing boys, singing boys, talking boys, and dancing boys, howling boys. Boys shuffled with their feet. Boys whirled about him, grinning and making faces, mimicking him behind his back and before his eyes, mimicking his poverty, his boots, his coat, his mother, everything belonging to him that they should have had consideration for. Silence! Cried Mr. Mell, suddenly rising up and striking his desk with the book. What does this mean? It's impossible to bear it. Oh, it's maddening. How can you do it to me, boys? It was my book that he struck his desk with, and as I stood beside him, following his eye as it glanced around the room, I saw the boys all stop. some suddenly surprised, some half afraid, and some, sorry perhaps. Steerforth's place was at the bottom of the school, at the opposite end of the long room. He's lounging with his back against the wall, hands in his pockets. He looked at Mr. Mell with his mouth shut up, as if he were whistling. Mr. Mell looked at him. "Silence, Mr. Steerforth," said Mr. Mell. "Nah, silence yourself," said Steerforth, turning red. "Whom are you talking to?" "Well, sit down," said Mr. Mell. "Yeah, sit down yourself," said Steerforth, and mind your business." Oh, there was a titter, and some applause, but Mr. Mell was so white that silence immediately succeeded, and one boy, who had darted out behind him to imitate his mother again, changed his mind and pretended to want a pen mended. "If you think, Mr. Steerforth," said Mr. Mell, "that I am not acquainted with the power you can establish over any mind here," he laid his hand, without considering what he did, as I supposed, upon my head, "or that I have not observed you within a few minutes urging your juniors on to every sort of outrage against me, you are mistaken." "Man, I don't give myself the trouble of thinking about you at all," said Steerforth coolly. "So I'm not mistaken as it happens. And when you make use of your position of favoritism here, sir," pursued Mr. Mell with his lip trembling, "oh, very much, to insult a gentleman—" "Nah. A what? Where is he?" said Steerforth. "Here. Oh, somebody cried out." What does that sound like? And then it just goes into, "Shame, Mr. Steerforth, too bad. It was Traddles." Oh, I thought he was just crying out like, "Ah!" in the back. But no, he's crying out saying, "Shame, J. Steerforth, too bad." It was Traddles, whom Mr. Mell instantly discomforted by bidding him to hold his tongue. I would have liked it better if Traddles just went, "Ha!" out of shock. "To insult one who is not fortunate in life, sir, and who will never give you the least offense, and the many reasons for not insulting whom you are old enough and wise enough to understand," said Mr. Mell, with his lips trembling more and more, "you commit a mean and base action. You can sit down or stand up as you please. Sir Copperfield, go on." "Nah, young Copperfield," said Steerforth, coming forward up to the room. "Stop a bit. I tell you what, Mr. Mell, once and for all, when you take the liberty of calling me mean or base or anything of that sort, you are an impudent beggar." Ouch. "You're always a beggar." Ouch. "You know, but when you do that, you're an impudent beggar." Ouch. "I am not clear whether he was going to strike Mr. Mell or Mr. Mell was going to strike him, or there was any such intention on either side. I saw a rigidity come upon the whole school, as if they had been turned into stone, and found that Mr. Creakle in the midst of us with Tungay at his side, and Mrs. and Miss Creakle looking in the door as they were frightened. Mr. Mell, with his elbows on his desk and his face in his hands, sat for some moments quite still. Mr. Mell," said Mr. Creakle, shaking him by the arm, and his whisper was so audible now that Tungay felt it was unnecessary to repeat his words. "You have not forgotten yourself, I hope?" "Oh, no, sir, no," returned the master, showing his face, shaking his head, and rubbing his hands in great agitation. "No, sir. No, I have remembered myself. No, Mr. Creakle, I have not forgotten myself. I have remembered myself, sir. I could wish you had remembered me a little sooner. Mr. Creakle, it would have been more kind, sir, more just, sir. It would have saved me something, sir." Mr. Creakle, looking hard at Mr. Mell, put his hand on Tungay's shoulder and got his feet upon the form close by and sat upon the desk. After still looking hard at Mr. Mell, wait, what? So Mr. Creakle puts his hand on Tungay's shoulder And then he sits on the desk that Tungay's sitting at? What is going on here? This is insane. All right, fine, whatever. It's like a puppet show. Like, now he's a puppet. It's just weird. It's odd. After still looking hard at Mr. Mell from his throne, as he shook his head, he rubbed his hands and remained in the same state of agitation. Mr. Creakle turned to Steerfourth and said, now, sir, as he don't condescend to tell me, what is this? Oh, Steerfourth evaded the question for a little while, looking at scorn and anger at his opponent, and remaining silent. I could not help thinking, even in that interval, I remember, what a noble fellow he was in appearance, and how homely and plain Mr. Mell looked opposed to him. What did he mean by talking about favorites then? Said Steerforth at length. Favorites? Repeated Mr. Creakle, with his veins in his forehead swelling quickly, as he's like sitting on this desk, like a ventriloquist dummy. Who talked about favorites? He did, said Steerforth. And pray, what did you mean by that, sir? Demanded Mr. Creakle, turning angrily on his assistant. I meant, Mr. Creakle, he returned in a low voice, as I said, that no pupil had a right to avail himself to his position of favoritism to degrade me. To degrade you? Said Mr. Creakle. My stars! But give me leave to ask you, Mr. What's your name? And here, Mr. Creakle folded his arms, cane and all, upon his chest. It made such a knot of his brows that his little eyes were hardly visible below them. Whether, when you talk about favorites, you showed proper respect to me? To me, sir, said Mr. Creakle, darting his head at him suddenly and drawing it back again. The principal of this establishment and your employer. It was not judicious, sir, I am willing to admit, said Mr. Mell. I should not have done so if I had been cool. Here, Steerforth struck in. Yeah, when he said I was mean, and then he said I was base, and then I called him a beggar. If I hadn't been cool, perhaps I shouldn't have called him a beggar. But I did, and I am ready to take the consequences of it. Ooh, well, look at him. Without considering, perhaps, whether there was any consequence to be taken, I felt quite in a glow at this gallant speech. It was a gallant speech, and it made an impression on the boys, too. There was a low stir among them, though no one spoke a word. I am surprised, Steerforth, although your candor does you honor, said Mr. Creakle. Does your honor, certainly. I am surprised, Steerforth, I must say, that you should attach such an epithet to any person employed and paid in Salem House, sir. Steerforth gave a short laugh. What does that sound like? Yeah, that's not an answer, sir, said Mr. Creakle. To my remark, I expect more than that from you, Steerforth. If Mr. Mell looked homely in my eyes before the handsome boy, he's really focused on this boy, it would be quite impossible to say how homely Mr. Creakle looked. Let him deny it, said Steerforth. Deny that he's a beggar, Steerforth? Cried Mr. Creakle. Why, where does he go a-begging? A-begging. Yeah, if he's not a beggar himself, his near relation's one, said Steerforth. It's all the same. He glanced at me, and Mr. Mell's hand gently patted me upon the shoulder. I looked up with a flush upon my face and remorse in my heart. But Mr. Mell's eyes were fixed on Steerforth. Oh, he continued to pat me kindly on the shoulder, but he looked at him. Since you expect me, Mr. Creakle, to justify myself, said Steerforth, and to say that what I mean... What I have to say is that his mother, lives on charity, in an almshouse. Mr. Mell still looked at him and still patted me kindly on my shoulder. What is going on with the patting on the shoulder thing? This is odd. He said to himself in a whisper, if I heard it right, yes, I thought so. Mr. Creakle turned to his assistant with a severe frown and labored politeness. Now, you hear what this gentleman says, Mr. Mell. Have the goodness, if you please, to set him right before the assembled school. Oh, he's right, sir, without correction, returned Mr. Mell, in the midst of a dead silence. What he said is true. Now be so good, then, as declare publicly, will you, said Mr. Creakle, putting his head on one side and rolling his eyes around the school. "Whether it ever came to my knowledge until this moment?" I believe not directly," he returned. "Why, you know not," said Mr. Creakle. "Don't you, man? I apprehend you never supposed my worldly circumstances to be very good," replied the assistant. "You know what my position is and always has been here." "I apprehend, if you come to that," said Mr. Creakle, with his veins swelling again, bigger than ever, "that you have been in a wrong position altogether and mistook this for a charity school, Mr. Mell. We'll part, if you please. The sooner the better." "Oh, there is no time," answered Mr. Mell, rising, "like the present." Sir, to you," said Mr. Creakle. "I take my leave of you," said Mr. Creakle. "And all of you," said Mr. Mell, glancing around the room and again patting me gently on the shoulders. "James Steerfourth, the best wish I can leave you is that you may come to be ashamed of what you have done today. At present, I would prefer to see you anything rather than a friend to me or anyone in whom I feel an interest." Well, with that, why don't we take a little break? Why don't we kick our shoes off, huh? Why don't we head to the master bedroom? Just you and me. Let's go in there. Let's get wet. Let's have a good time. All right? And I will read to you a new romance novel that's coming out soon. Ah, there you are. Prepared for me on the romantic bed here in the master bedroom. Wearing your silky outfit, but that's not what I want. Tonight I want to get nerdy. Tonight we're going to LARP. Put on this wizard's outfit as I read to you a new upcoming romance novel called A Lady's Formula for Love by Elizabeth Everett. It's part of the Secret Scientists of London line of books. Doesn't say anything about if she's a New York Times bestselling author. No, she's not. Oh, well, that's disturbing. That's another person who's too lazy to get their name plastered on that. About a lady's formula for love? What is a Victorian lady's formula for love? Mix one brilliant noblewoman and her enigmatic protection officer. Add in a measure of danger and attraction. Heat over the warmth of humor and friendship. And the result is more than simple chemistry. It's elemental. Lady Violet, she's keeping secrets. First, she has founded a clandestine sanctuary for England's most brilliant female scientists. Second, she's using her genius on a confidential mission for the crown. But the biggest secret of all, her feelings for protection officer Arthur Snelland. Solitary and reserved, Arthur learned the hard way to put duty first. But the more time he spends in the company of Violet and the eccentric club members, the more his best intentions go up in flames. Literally. When a shadowy threat infiltrates Violet's laboratories, endangering her life and her work, scientist and bodyguard will find all their theories put to the test and learn that the most important discoveries are those of the heart. So, that Turd Fest is coming out February 9th, 2021. Well, I'm not aroused anymore. Might as well take off the wizard outfit and, put on your normal clothes, and we'll head back into the library and finish this book. Well, let's pick up where we left off as Mr. Mell is being forced to resign because of his terrible family secret, that his mom is poor. Once more he laid his hand upon my shoulder, and then taking his flute and a few books from his desk, and leaving the key in it for his... I forgot he plays the flute. And he went out of the school with his property under his arm. Mr. Creakle then made a speech through Tungay, in which he thanked Steerfourth for asserting, though perhaps too warmly, the independence and respectability of Salem House, in which he wound up by shaking hands with Steerfourth while we gave 3 cheers. This is weird. Everyone's celebrating that they got a poor person to leave. I did not quite know what for, but I suppose Steerforth, and so joined in them ardently, though I felt miserable. And Mr. Creakle then caned Tommy Traddles for being discovered in tears instead of cheers, and accounted Mr. Mel's departure, and went back to his sofa, or his bed, or wherever he had come from. We were left to ourselves now, and looked very blank, I recollect, on one another. For myself, I felt so much self-reproach and consternation for my part in what had happened that nothing would have enabled me to keep back my tears but the fear of Steerforth, who often looked at me, I saw, might think it unfriendly, or, I should rather say, considering our relative ages, that the feeling with which I regarded him undutiful if I showed the emotion which distressed me. Oh, he's so into this guy he won't even show his real feelings. Much like every relationship I've ever been in. He was very angry with Traddles and said he was glad he had caught it. Poor Traddles, who'd passed the stage of lying with his head upon his desk and was relieving himself as usual with a burst of skeletons, said he didn't care. Mr. Mel was ill-used. Who has ill-used him? You girl, said Steerforth. Wow, Steerforth's a monster. Why, you have, returned Traddles, and Traddles is a hero. What have I done? Said Steerforth. What have you done? Retorted Traddles. Hurt his feelings and lost him his reputation. His feelings, replied Steerforth disdainfully, his feelings will soon get the better of it, I'll be bound. His feelings are not like yours, Miss Traddles. As to his situation, which was a precious one, wasn't it? Do you suppose I am not going to write home and take care that he gets some money? Polly? We thought this intention very noble in Steerforth, whose mother was a widow and rich, and would do almost anything, it was said, that he asked of her. We were all extremely glad to see Traddles so put down, so exalted Steerforth to the skies, especially when he told us, as he condescended to do, that what he had done had been done expressly for us, and for our cause, and that he had conferred a great boon upon us by unselfishly doing it. But I must say that when I was going on with the story in the dark that night, Mr. Mel's old flute seemed more than once to sound mournfully in my ears. Oh, I would have liked if he's just standing outside the building playing his flute mournfully. But nope, he's imagining it. And that when at last Steerforth was tired, and I lay down in my bed, I fancied it playing so sorrowfully somewhere that I was quite wretched. I soon forgot him in the contemplation of Steerforth, who, in an easy amateur way and without any book, he seemed to me to know everything by heart, took some of his classes until a new master was found. The new master came from a grammar school, and before he entered on his duties, dined in the parlor one day to be introduced to Steerforth. Steerforth approved of him highly, and told us he was a brick, whatever that's supposed to mean, without exactly understanding what learned distinction was meant by this. I respected him greatly for it, and had no doubt whatever of his superior knowledge, though he never took the pains with me. Not that I was anybody that Mr. Mel had taken. There was only one other event in this half-year out of the daily school life that made an impression upon me, which still survives. It survives for many reasons. One afternoon, when we were all harassed into a state of dire confusion, and Mr. Creakle was laying about him dreadfully, Tungay come in, called out in his usual strong way, "Visitors for Copperfield." A few words were interchanged between him and Mr. Creakle as who the visitors were and what room they were to be shown into, and then I, who had burp according to custom, stood up on the announcement of being made and felt quite faint with astonishment, was told to go backstairs. The backstairs. Go to the backstairs. I screwed that up. It got a clean frill on. I cannot read anything, and I'm burping like crazy. Before I repaired to the dining room, these orders I obeyed in such a flutter and hurry of my young spirits as I had never known before. And when I got to the parlor door, and the thought came into my head that it might be my mother, I had only thought of Mr. or Miss Murdstone until then. I drew back my hand from the lock and stopped. To have a sob before I went in. At first, I saw nobody. Feeling a pressure against the door, I looked around it, and there, to my amazement, were Mr. Peggotty and Ham, ducking at me with their hats. And they're hiding behind the door, like every mystery or murder. Like he opens the door and they like sneak behind it. Is that what's happening right now? And squeezing one another against the wall. I could not help laughing. But it was much more the pleasure of seeing them than the appearance that they made. We shook hands, in a cordial way, and I laughed, and laughed, until I pulled out my pocket handkerchief and wiped my eyes. Mr. Peggotty, who never shut his mouth once, I remember, during the visit. What? Just sitting there slack-jawed, showed great concern when he saw me do this and nudged Ham to say something. Cheer up, Master Davy boy, said Ham in a simpering way. Why, how you've growed. Am I grown? I said, drying my eyes. I was not crying or anything in particular that I know of, but somehow it made me cry to see old friends. Growed, Master Davy Boar? What is boar supposed to... Is it boy? Question mark. Ain't he growed, said Ham. Ain't he growed, said Mr. Peggotty. They made me laugh again by laughing at each other. And then we all three laughed, till I was in danger of crying again. This is weird. Do you know how Mama is, Mr. Peggotty? I said, and how my dear, dear old Peggotty is? Uncommon, said Mr. Peggotty. And little Emily and Miss Gummidge. Uncommon, said Mr. Peggotty. On big long M- common. There was a silence. Mr. Peggotty, to relieve it, took 2 prodigious lobsters and an enormous crab and a large canvas bag of shrimps out of his pockets. What? How big are his pockets? And piled them up in Ham's arms. You see, said Mr. Peggotty, knowing as you were partial to a little relish with your whittles when you was along with us, we took the liberty. The old Mother biled M, she said. Mrs. Gummidge biled M, yes, said Mr. Peggotty. I don't like how they talk. Slowly, who I thought appeared to stick the subject on account of having no other subject ready. Mrs. Gummidge, I do assure you, she biled 'em. I expressed my thanks, and Mr. Peggotty, after looking at Ham, who stood smiling sheepishly over the shellfish, without making any attempt to help, and said, we come, you see, the wind and tide making in our favor, in one of our Yarmouth lugs to Gravesend. My sister, she wrote to me the name of this here place, and wrote to me if I ever chanced to come to Gravesend, I was to come over and inquire for Master Davy, and give her duty with 2 O's, humbly wishing him well, and reporting of the family that they was uncommon. To be sure, TOE-BE-SURE, to be sure. Little Emily, you see, she'll write to my sister when I go back, as I see you, and as you was similarly uncommon, and so we make it quite a merry-go-rounder. I was obliged to consider, a little before I understood that what Mr. Peggotty meant by this figure, expressive of a complete circle of intelligence, and I thanked him heartily, and said, with a consciousness of reddening, that I suppose little Emily, was altered too, since we used to pick up shells and pebbles on the beach. She's getting to be a woman. That's what she's getting to be, said Mr. Peggotty. Ask him, in italics. He meant Ham, who beamed with delight and assent over the bag of shrimps. Her pretty face, said Mr. Peggotty, his own shining like a light. Her learning, said Ham. Her writing, exclamation point, said Mr. Peggotty. Why, it's as black as jet, and so large it is you might see it anywheres. The way she writes. It was perfectly delightful to behold with what enthusiasm Mr. Peggotty became inspired when he thought of his little favorite. Oh, he stands before me again, his bluff, hairy face irradiating with a joyful love and pride, for which I can find no description. Honest eyes fire up and sparkle, as if their depths were stirred by something bright. His broad chest, heaves with pleasure. His strong, loose hands clench themselves in his earnestness, and he emphasizes what he says with a right arm that shows, in my pygmy view, like a sledgehammer. Ham was quite as earnest as he. I dare say they would have said much more about her if they had not been abashed by the unexpected coming in Steerfourth, who, seeing me in a corner speaking with two strangers, stopped in a song he was singing and said, I don't know. You were here, young Copperfield, for it was not the usual visiting room, and crossed by us on his way out. Well, I'm not sure whether it was in the pride of having such a friend as Steerforth, or in the desire, he's a horrible person, or in the desire to explain to him how I came to have such a friend as Mr. Peggotty, that I called to him as he was going away. But I said, modestly, good heaven, how it all comes back to me, this long time afterwards, big M dash, exclamation point. Don't go, Steerforth, if you please. These are two Yarmouth boatmen, very kind, good people, who are relations of my nurse, and who have come from Gravesend to see me. They're poor, they live in a boat. Steerforth isn't going to like them, he's going to make fun of them, probably send them away. Aye, said Steerforth, returning. I am glad to see them. How are you both? There was an ease in his manner, a gay and light manner it was, but not swaggering, which I still believe to have been born a kind of enchantment with it. I still believe him, in virtue of his carriage, his animal spirits, his delightful voice, his handsome face and figure, and, for aught I know, of some inborn power of attraction, besides which I think few people possess, to have carried a spell with him to which it is natural weakness to yield, in which not many persons could withstand. I could not but see how pleased they were with him, and how they seemed to open their hearts to him in a moment. You must let them know at home, if you please, Mr. Peggotty, I said, when the letter is sent, that Mr. Steerforth is very kind to me, and that I don't know what I should ever do without him. Nonsense, said Mr. Steerforth, with an exclamation point, laughing. You mustn't tell him anything of the sort, And if Mr. Steerforth ever comes into Norfolk or Suffolk, said Mr. Peggotty, I said, while I am there, you may depend upon it I shall bring him to Yarmouth, if he will let me, to see your house. You never saw such a good house, Steerforth. It's made out of a boat. Now, here we go. This is where Steerforth goes south. Made out of a boat, is it? Said Steerforth. It's the right sort of house for such a thorough-built boatman. So 'tis so, sir, 'tis sir, said Ham, grinning. You're right, young gentleman. Master Davy bore gentleman's right. A thorough-built boatman, whore. That's what he is, too! Exclamation point. Well, Mr. Peggotty was no less pleased than his nephew, though his modesty forbade him to claim a personal compliment so vicious, vociferous. Let's look that one up. Vociferously, no? Vociferous. Yeah, vociferously. Well, sir, he said, bowing and chuckling and tucking the ends of his neckerchief in his breast, I thank ye, sir, I thank you. I do endeavors in my line of life, sir. The best of men can do no more, Mr. Peggotty, said Steerforth. He had got his name already. I'll pound it. It's what you do yourself, sir, said Mr. Peggotty, shaking his head. Everyone's just glad-handing each other now. Everyone's just getting into this. And what you do well, right well. I thank ye, sir. I'm obliged to you, sir, for your welcoming manner of me. I'm rough, sir, but I am ready. Least he says that again. Leastways, I hope I'm ready. You understand. I don't know what he means. My house ain't much for to see, sir, but it's hearty, at your service, if you ever should come along with Master Davy to see it. I'm a regular Dodman, I am, said Mr. Peggotty, by which he meant a snail. I have no idea what any of that meant, and his was all an illusion of being slow to go, for he had attempted to go after every sentence, and had somehow or other come back again. But I wish you both well, and I wish you happy. Ham echoed this sentiment, and we parted with them in the heartiest manner. And I was almost tempted that evening to tell Steerfourth about pretty little Emily, but I was too timid to mention, don't tell her about that, because Steerfourth already got worked into a lather over a fantasy sister he might have. Don't talk about pretty little Emily. He's going to go diving into that whole thing. Too much afraid of his laughing at me. I remember that I thought a good deal, and an uneasy sort of way, about Mr. Peggotty having said that she was getting on to be a woman. But I decided that was nonsense. We transported the sailfish, or the relish, as Mr. Peggotty had modestly called it, up into our room unobserved. And then where do they put it? It's got to stink up the whole room. And made a great supper that evening. How? On a hot plate? What are they doing? But Traddles couldn't get happily out of it. He was too unfortunate even to come through a supper like anybody else. He was taken ill in the night. Quite prostrate he was, in consequence of crab. And after being drugged with black draughts and blue pills, to an extent which Demple, whose father was a doctor, said was enough to undermine a horse's constitution, received a caning and 6 chapters of Greek Testament for refusing to confess. The rest of the half year, this poor guy, he's like the only hero of this whole story. The rest of the half year, as a jumble of my recollection of the daily strife and struggle of our lives, of the waning summer and the changing season of the frosty mornings, when we were wrung out of bed, and the cold smell of the dark nights when we were wrung into bed again, of the evening schoolroom, dimly lighted and indifferent warmed. They have school in the evening? How long do their school days last? Out of the morning schoolroom, which was nothing but a great shivering machine, of the alternation of the boiled beef with roast beef, and the boiled mutton with roast mutton, of clods, of bread and butter, dog's-eared, lesson books, cracked slates, tear-blotted copybooks, canings, rulerings, hair cuttings, rainy Sundays, suet puddings, and a dirty atmosphere of ink surrounding all. I remember well, though, how the distant idea of the holidays, after seeming for an immense time to be a stationary speck, began to come toward us, and to grow and grow. How from counting months we came to weeks, and then to days, and how I then began to be afraid that I should not be sent for when I'd learned from Steerfourth that I had been sent for, and was certain to go home, had dim forebodings that I might break my leg first. How the breaking up day changes place fast and last, from the week after next to next week, this week, the day after tomorrow, and tomorrow, today, tonight. What the heck was that sentence? When I was inside the Yarmouth mail and going home. Oh, I had many a broken sleep inside the Yarmouth mail, and many an incoherent dream of all these things. But when I awoke at intervals, the ground outside the window was not the playground of Salem House, and the sound in my ears was not the sound of Mr. Creakle giving it to Traddles, the hero of the book, but the sound of the coachman touching up the horses. Wow, that was a nice little ending. With that, let's retire into the smoking room to review what we've read. Oof. There was a lot in that story, or in this chapter. But who would have thought a group of kids hanging out would have so much dynamics going on there? So many complicated situations. It's a lot to unpack. So why don't we recap the story so far? Mr. Creakle loves to beat the crap out of people. He's constantly doing it for no reason, just hitting him with a cane constantly, or a ruler, or whatever. We learn about Traddles, cute little guy. He's got a lot of demons. He's got a whole dark side to him. But he never snitches. He's constantly the foil for Creakle. He's just getting the poop beat out of him over and over and over again. But he's never guilty, and he's always never telling who's the real problem. We learn that Traddles is a chubby man. And we also learn that David is chubby, apparently, as well. So that was a little thing we got to learn. Because Creakle loves to beat the poop out of chubby kids. So we learned that for that reason. James Steerfourth, he decides to backsass Mr. Mel during one of their classes. And, he backsasses him good. He's got a real sass mouth. And then things go real south. At first, you're like, oh, here we go. It's James Steerfourth, the oldest kid, and no one ever beats him. And so here we go. We get to see the hero rise up against the oppressors. Now, he turns on Mr. Mel and points out that Mr. Mel's mom is poor. And that Mr. Mel comes from a poor family. And that is the straw that breaks the camel's back for Mr. Creakle. So basically, Mr. Mel has to quit right there on the spot in front of the kids and everything. So none of this, they don't have HR or anything. This is all a bad show. Steerfourth, he hates poor people, apparently. So, yep, you got to go. So Mr. Mel, the whole time this conversation is happening, keeps patting David on the shoulder. I don't know why. It's weird. But I guess you're supposed to feel empathy for Mr. Mel as he's showing kindness to David while he's being forced to resign because there is no HR representative to step in and say, take him into a different room. Talk to him about how being poor is inappropriate. Always. And then ask him to leave without the students watching. But for no reason, David loves Steerforth through the whole thing. Then, for no reason, one day Mr. Peggotty and Ham show up to visit him. And they're super poor. The way they talk is poor. Everything about them's poor. But they brought a bunch of shellfish with them. And randomly, Steerforth's just wandered around with his hands in his pockets, kicking cans, whistling to himself, being real, self-satisfied. Little jerk. He comes in, he gets to meet them, and for some reason doesn't judge them for living in a boat for a house instead of a mansion that Steerforth probably requires of everyone he speaks to. Probably because they had all that lobster there waiting for them. So that's probably the reason why he's so sweet. But in the end, they bring all the lobster and everything else up to their bedroom and just start eating it, I guess, raw. It makes no sense. They're traveling, the Peggottys, with this lobster. I'm sure it's warm. The lobster is like a type of ocean bug, and that ocean bug's meat had to have gone kind of sour at that point. But they don't cook it. They don't have a hot plate in their room or anything like that. So I guess they're just eating it raw in the bedroom. Traddles, he doesn't feel good because he's got a sensitive stomach. He's a sensitive, chubby boy. And so he gets sick, and the next day, of course, Mr. Creakle is like, why are you sick? And just beats the crap out of him. But Traddles won't snitch, and that's pretty much the end of the story. Well, what's good about what we read today? Traddles, a humble, sensitive little boy who's really the hero out of this whole thing. Not Mr. Steersforth or whatever the heck his name is. What sucks is Steersforth. I'm not saying his name right. Yeah, Steerfourth. He's the jerk because he is an elitist and he loves rich people. What do we learn? The rich people are horrible people. I can take this attitude now that I'm about a week and a half away from being unemployed. Screw the rich. Screw them. They're always trying to step on the little man. I read The Iron Heel when I started this podcast. I know what it's all about. And I told you I'm going to be surly on this podcast. I can be. It's my show. Sucks to you. I know this is a long episode. Go away if you don't like it. So, with that, thanks for listening. and I will see you next week. Well, it appears you found me in the part of the podcast I hate the most, where I tell you all about the places on the internet where you can find me. You can tell I hate this because of the sound effects making it sound like a stormy night in the drawing room of the damned. Now, there's that. Are you cool? I like cool people. It's the reason why I got involved in this business to begin with, just to meet cool people. Not losers. So if you're cool, feel free to go over to my website, nuzzlehouse.com. You can see a backlog of everything I've ever read, along with episodes from the Book Boys and blah, blah, blah. You can also find me on Instagram, which is House Nuzzle. And conveniently enough, Twitter, which is also @HouseNuzzle. Annoyingly, YouTube made me pick a name instead of just a House Nuzzle, so I got Glen Nuzzles. So I guess you search for that if you want to watch a screen that doesn't do anything and just hear my voice. And since I think you might be cool, you can always just email me directly, glen.nuzzles@gmail.com. But don't email if you're a nerdlinger or a dork. Now, back to business. Can't believe I drank all of them already. There's got to be one left.